To kick off our guest artist episodes, I have with me Paul Guzzone, who is not only a composer, singer, bassist, producer, and musical director, but the co-owner of a production company named Triple Z Music and an adjunct professor teaching the history of rock music and the business of entertainment at Pace University. How are you, Paul?
I'm fine, given our certain circumstances. I'm doing pretty darn good. Thank you very much, Abby.
Okay, we're gonna start very nebulous. Just how did you originally get into music? Just sort of like, when did you realize you had a love for it, and what like elements did you find yourself gravitating towards?
Well, like most people of my generation, I was dumbstruck when I saw the Beatles on the Ed Sullivan Show. Frankly, that's where it all started for me and probably 90% of my colleagues who are my age. I'm 68 years old now. So I would imagine that's where it started. But the truth is, once I saw that and I picked up a guitar, let me backtrack a little bit. I actually was playing the violin before that. I picked up the violin when I was in grammar school. So I was interested in music, and we had music playing in my household, although nobody in my household was a musician. We had a record player. We had the first stereo on our block. So my parents bought stereo recordings. Granted, a lot of them were Italian singers singing in Italian, but there were also, I had two older brothers, and they also played rock and roll music, and Frank Sinatra and Tony Bennett, and from that generation. So it was around me, and I had a natural love for music. But it wasn't until I saw the Beatles that I thought there's a possibility I could actually do this. And then I started taking guitar lessons, having already studied violin. So I had a sense of what playing music meant. So that really kicked it off for sure. And when it was, of course, I continued to play it until I got into high school. And in high school, I formed my first band, and I belonged to the folk club. In my school, we had a folk music club. This was Christ the King High School, Middle Village, Queens. 1966 to 1970, 4 years, and we're still the carryover of the folk music boom from the early 60s, Dylan, folk rock, all that stuff. So I got an appreciation for songwriting and lyric writing from that experience, and it just went on from there.
So your high school band, which I read through all your biographies, it was called Revival, right?
Oh my gosh, you really did your research.
I
Holy
did.
smoke. Holy smoke. Yes, the band was called Revival, as in folk revival. That's where the name came from.
So, okay, was it a folk band?
No. it was a folk rock band. It was a psychedelic rock band. It was a country rock band. All these hyphenated rock, something rock. It was a New York City based band. Which came about when most of the musicians in New York City had already moved to Los Angeles, and we were still here. And we were kind of like, if anything, it was a band called the Love and Spoonful, which is a Greenwich Village band from the 60s. We were very much like that, very eclectic mixture of music. There was jug band music, folk music, rock and roll, psychedelic music. We were listening to the Grateful Dead and the Beatles and Jimi Hendrix. So all of that was mashed up together in that band.
So then you signed to a label, and were able to keep that sort of sound when signing to a label?
Well, it got screwed up real good by our producer. That's an old story. Our managers, wonderful people, who I'm still friends with one of them, who's the surviving member of the management team, Alan Pepper. Wonderful people. That was my entree into the New York City music industry through Alan Pepper and Stanley Sadowski. They got us a record deal on Buddha Kamasutra Records. We were thrilled to death to have it. We thought we were on our way. Every band that has gotten to this point, or every musician that has gotten to this point, figures it's done. I'm there. Not knowing really how the business works. So we got our record deal. We got into a studio. Somebody else was paying the bills. We were happy. We seemed to have endless amounts of time in the studio. That was the thing back then in the early 70s. They were paying for all kinds of time in the studio. The main component was the producer didn't understand what we were doing. And the record did not really reflect what we were doing live. Although we sold a lot of records in New York City, because that's where our fan base was, we really couldn't break out of the Northeast. So, and we got played on the radio a lot. We had lots of airplay on the rock stations in this area, but there was no single, there was no big pop um, uh, hit record, no pop song on the record that could really cross over. So that was that.
So I guess that explains why I had it. The later band that you were in called Little Criminals.
Right.
Was it a conscious decision to not be signed in that case?
No, no, we wanted to. We would have loved to have had a record deal, but we were pretty, again, I was a pretty eclectic. I am a pretty eclectic musician. We were playing our own music, and we were very influenced by the mid-'70s bands of that era, people like Steely Dan, Fleetwood Mac, even though there was no girl singer in that band, soul music, funk music. And we were not doing what was happening in New York in the mid-'70s, which was punk and disco. So we couldn't really work and make any money in New York City. So we hit the road, and we were very lucky. We're a self-managed band. We made connections and self-booked. And we got into a van, and we just drove down south, and we hit a whole circuit of clubs throughout the Southeast, from Virginia to Florida and back. So we were able to go out and do, over a period of about 2.5 or 3 years, we toured quite a bit, able to play all these little clubs and occasional colleges. We did. We got a bunch of college dates. In fact, we played Pace University back then, before I was teaching there. At Schimmel Center, I recall. And so we'd get college dates and club dates. There was a vibrant music scene, live music scene throughout the South during that period, where you could play your own music and not have to do Bee Gees songs, or Gloria Gaynor disco songs, or songs by new wave acts like the Police. Yeah, I guess the Police were out then, late '70s. So that's how that worked out. But that enabled me to grow as a songwriter and a band leader with that group.
And so and then there's like this jump, at least like in your biography wise, where you're going from this very like '70s inspired eclectic taste to doing corporate music, and at least in my mind, those two things do not match up. How did
they don't match up? They don't match up. The reason for that was we came back to New York City. I was writing my own songs. I left Little Criminals, put out an independent record called Dancing Room. Through my brother at the time, helped finance that, and we got a record promoter, and we got played. My record got played on a bunch of radio stations, and that was actually really close to happening for me. But I sounded like Billy Joel. I didn't intend to sound like Billy Joel, but I had that kind of a voice. I was essentially a white rock musician from New York City. And when Billy Joel's Glass Houses came out, it knocked my record off of the play charts, the playlists of radio stations, as it was starting to go. And there was only room for one, artist from New York City who was like that. And clearly Billy Joel on Columbia Records had the clout, not me. So that record disappeared. But that got me a lot of notice as a music producer and a songwriter, which I was able to parlay into getting a production job at a music production house, several different music production houses in the New York area. And I started doing not just corporate shows, but local radio commercials, which I built a resume of doing radio ads. And then that got me into a larger production company, which specialized in corporate shows. At that point in time, I was in my late 20s, early 30s, I guess. I was 30 years old when that finally happened, 31 maybe. And, I was a producer, and I was writing on assignment. So I was, although it's not, you're right to say that the music I was playing in the '70s and mid '70s, the original music, had nothing to do with corporate shows. It did train me to figure out what made songs work, how to speak to people who are not musicians, had to hit a deadline. You learn certain skills. You come up with a skill set that's kind of unique to music producers in the commercial music business, television commercials and corporate shows. So it just was like a snowball. It just kept on going and going. And that became a career. Now, mind you, I did miss being on the road, but I was still working with great musicians. Working in New York City in the 1980s and 1990s was quite remarkable. I got to work with amazing singers, engineers, recording studios, musicians, arrangers. It was fantastic. We get up every day and pinch yourself thinking that you're actually doing this. And actually I was getting a paycheck. Sometimes, there were good years and bad years, but I was making money. And it was a real legitimate career. So it was hard. So a couple of friends of mine who were hugely successful in the jingle business, they wrote major ad campaigns in the 80s and 90s for people like, Chevrolet and McDonald's and Burger King and AT&T. They called it the velvet handcuffs. These were great artists, great musicians, great songwriters who could not break away from doing that because it was too lucrative to walk away from. And they called it the velvet handcuffs. So on some level, I could appreciate that. I was not making the kind of money these guys were making, but I was doing better than most of my musician friends were doing. So, it was hard to walk away from that. I just couldn't do that. But it was a training ground. I constantly learned. And I'll say this, it was around that time that I started teaching at Pace University. And that was wonderful because I would go in the spring and the fall, I would meet a whole batch of young men and women who had very different music tastes than I did. I would teach them a history of the music as I heard it, and I would hear from them what was happening right now. So what was happening in 1988, 92, 96, 2000, 2001. And I couldn't possibly have the knowledge that my students had about what was happening at that very moment. So my students turned me on to certain styles of music and certain DJs, remixers, hip hop artists, EDM artists. And I was a sponge for that. And I would take all of that and bring it to my job, which enabled me to, to have information that some of the people that my clients needed to hear. I was able to maintain credibility and be contemporary through that. So it was really a give and take. The whole thing with Pace University is kind of a blessing in that sense,
So I guess, why did you originally decide to become a teacher though?
That's a really good story. At Pace University, I have friends who were going to school there in the 70s and in the 1970s. And there was the performing arts department as it exists today is unrecognizable from what it was back then. Back then, I think on any given year, there were 40, 50, 60 majors in what was then called speech and drama. When I first worked there, it was called the speech and drama department. Then it became the theater department. Theater and fine arts. It was theater and fine arts. And then that became just the theater department. So there was never really a big department. So for them to put on their musicals, they would have to go outside of the department to get players. They would bring in directors. There were enough actors and actresses for sure, but there was no musicians and there was no musical director, no musical theater department as there is now, or dance department as there is now. So my friends who were in the departments would put together bands for their musicals, and I would be one of the players in the band. Eventually I graduated to musical directing plays. Some of students became teachers there, and they were now teaching, and they would direct plays, and I would be music directing their plays. The chairman of the department at one point I guess it was in 1988, I think. The chairman at the time, August of that, leading into the fall semester, the person who was going to be teaching the rock history class just dropped out suddenly, and he was left in the lurch with 2 sections that he needed to have somebody teach. And somebody recommended me to teach it because they knew I was a musician. I had a relationship with certain people at Pace, and I got a phone call one day from the chair of the department asking if I'd be interested in teaching. Have I ever thought about teaching? And I hadn't. And I honestly think he was desperate enough. He said, well, if you could read through this syllabus, if you tell me you think you could do this, I'll recommend you for the job. I mean, it was literally that. I wasn't looking for it. And this is while I was sort of just building my resume as a music producer and working at a little production house. So it seemed like an interesting thing to do. I liked it. I liked this guy who was the chair of the department. I'd worked for him as a music director, and I just started doing it. And they let me teach it. One thing led to another, and I've been there ever since. It was like that. It was not on my list of things to accomplish, but honestly, it's been a huge blessing over these years.
Which I guess then brings us to the current day.
Yep.
And that also dovetails into your involvement with this podcast.
Yes.
So I wanted to host some other mediums of expression, sent out a call, and you responded with one of your original songs called Radio Waves.
You and me, you and me, we're like radio waves. We'll go on forever, like the glow of the moon and the stars. We're pretty much here to stay. Age is a virtue like wine. We keep getting better over time. Wind and water turn steel to rust, but the forces of nature, they got nothing on us, no. 'Cause we're like radio waves. We'll go on forever. Yeah. Time is a gift. How do you take its measure? Take nothing for granted, but take in every pleasure. Remember to remember, the past is in the past. Through it all, our love was meant to last. We'll still be here long after tomorrow, long after tomorrow, long after tomorrow. We'll still be here long after tomorrow, long after tomorrow, long after tomorrow. Yeah, we'll still be here long after tomorrow, long after tomorrow. Long after tomorrow. We're like radio waves. Yeah, we'll go on and on forever. Like the glow of the moon and the stars, we're pretty much here to stay. Yeah. Age is but a state of mind. We'll just keep getting better over time. Wind and water turn mountains to dust, but the forces of nature, they got nothing on us. Gravity, momentum, and relativity don't even come close. to you and me. Yeah. You and me. Cause we're like radio waves. Yeah. We'll go on forever. We're like radio waves. Yeah. We'll go on forever. We're like radio waves.
So I guess, again, starting very nebulous, why did you choose to send him this song specifically?
I love podcasts. I make a point of describing in the media section of my entertainment industry class at Pace. I talk about podcasts as being, internet radio. Essentially, it's another version of radio. I've always loved radio. I connect podcasts to that. When I'm on the road, when I was touring the last few years with the Bacon Brothers, and we were on tour buses, life on the road you get into a certain rhythm. You do a show, you pull into a town, you check into the hotel, you do your sound check, you do your show, you do your after show meal, your party, whatever it is. You get back on the tour bus and you drive to the next show. It's literally that, day after day after day. After you've done a show and a party and you're back on the tour bus and it's 1 o'clock in the morning and you're supposed to go to bed, it's hard to fall asleep. That's when I got into podcasts. I started through Spotify. If the signal was good enough for me, I would go into my bunk, put on Spotify, find a podcast, and it was great. It was like, jumping into this other world, hearing these people talk. It was like being a guest at a cocktail party or something, where you could just hear people talking about interesting subjects, things that interest you. And the immediacy of that, I just knocked me out. And I've always loved radio and radio theater in particular, because it's theater of the mind. It's you use your imagination. So the idea of you doing the podcast, I thought, well, what would appeal to? And your letter, if I recall, had to do with love too, right? It was, you were looking for expressions of love, poetry, songs, and I thought, well, she's doing a podcast. I've got a love song which uses radio as a metaphor, radio waves as a metaphor. I thought it would be fun for you to hear it, and I was thrilled when you reacted the way you did.
Yeah, it fits just perfectly, I think, which is just this wonderful thing that it's sort of come together.
Good.
So I guess then from that, with radio waves, was there a specific inspiration or? Yeah.
Well, yeah. Well, people always ask, well, when you write songs, people always ask you to write the words first, you write the music first. Every songwriter I know carries around a little book. Now we use our phones with our memos in it. And, you never know when something's going to hit you as an idea. This idea came to me when I was driving around somewhere up here in the Northeast. And there was a DJ on the radio, a local rock station. And he said something like, and we're all like radio waves. We just go on and on forever. And I thought, man, that's a song title. That's a concept. And what a great idea for a musician who loves radio to write a song. But what is that? What would it be? And I thought, it's a love song because it's an expression of love. If you're really in love with someone and you're dedicated to them, you want it to last forever. And we know that life doesn't last forever. But physics tells us in some way we live on. So, the idea of living on through radio waves, this idea of us continuing to flow. My words are going out there into the universe and they're never ending. They're just sailing and sailing away. I thought it was a very romantic image of comparing our love to something that will last forever. It defies gravity. It defies all of the laws of nature. It just continues to go on and on forever. I thought that was just impossible. It was irresistible to write a song about that.
So you have these great like strikes of like, oh, this would be excellent. How do you find that then transferring like to other, it's difficult to word. How do you find, so you get this spark. How do you then sort of hone and distill that into something that you can then actually bring to a studio?
Well, there's a lot in that question. So you're saying, correct me if I'm wrong, once I had the idea for the title, how did the title then become a song?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Well, there's the story. We're storytellers, so I had to clarify in my head what that story was going to be. It really helps if you have a character in your head to help you write the words. You hope that it's heartfelt, which in this case it was. Then for this particular song, the process was the title, "We're Like Radio Waves," and then the following line, "We go on and on forever. We're like radio waves. We go on and on forever." And that was repeating in my head until there was a rhythm to it. So I sat down in my studio. I'm a bass player, and this song interestingly started with bass and drums. So I felt the groove of the words. I found a program or created a program. I forget now whether it was a drum loop or a program that I made, which in tempo felt right with the words. And then it's a mantra, it's sort of a chanting thing. It's a repetitive thing. You hear these words over and over again, and I played the bass until the bass and the drums locked into the rhythm of the words. So I had that much of the song. It's just a piece of the song, but it was the basis for the song. So when you've got that as a producer songwriter, when you've got the basis for a song, and you could hear it in pop music today, I think of virtually every song that's created in a studio today. I'm not talking about a folk song or a country song that's maybe played live, but something that's made in a studio. You could tell there's a certain repetition and chord patterns that are repeated over and over again. And I could hear the process of songwriting in that. You kind of deconstruct the music down to its elements, and you can write what we call a top line on top of it, and build your story from there. So that was the beginning of it, and then of course I had to write the rest of the song. Now, at the time that I was writing that song, I was listening to a lot of Adele records. I think it was when her album 21 came out. 2015, 21, maybe it was 21, I think, I don't remember now. But her records are lush vocal recordings, and she overdubs her voice a lot. So somewhere in the back of my mind, I was thinking I'd like to have that element in this, a chorus of lush vocals, but I also wanted it to be very personal. So in my head, I had this production concept, but it took a few days of me working on the lyrics until the story was right. And then once the lyrics were done, and I had the melody and the chord pattern in my head, I just started producing it and layering it with all the sound elements that you hear on the recording now.
Just insane, I guess, at least to me, that you can just sort of do that. You were like, oh yeah, I figured out the bass. And I was like, that goes so over my head personally. That's very insane. So I think just because you've said so many wonderful things, to sort of wrap this up and distill it, I think, what sort of advice would you give to someone starting out? Because especially when you say, oh, I think of these things and I come up with this, and it just sort of sounds like it all comes from your heart. What would you say to someone that like is starting that, but just kind of not quite, that's, yes.
Well, that's the perennial question. My students ask my wife and I that all the time. I think the most generic answer, I don't mean this negative, I don't mean it to be that it's glib or flip. It's the standard answer I give is really to be true to yourself and your process. I mean, Shakespeare was right, because in this world, the most joy you're going to get out of art is creating the art. Do not do it because you want to become rich. Do not do it because you want to be like somebody else. I mean, you are inspired. Everybody's inspired by someone, but remain true to yourself and get all the joy you can out of the process of creating the art. That's the best part. And please yourself. And if it means, I happen to love pop music, I'm not a pop star, but I love pop music. I love the simple melodies. I love the expression of pop music. I also love folk music and I love lyrics. So, and I love grooves. I'm a rhythm section player. So I try to put all those things into my music. And I get joy out of that. Occasionally you hit a home run. A lot of times you miss, but you got to keep on swinging and missing until you hit one. Let's say about baseball, right? If you're successful 1/3 of the time, you've got a great career. It means you miss 2/3 of the time. With acting, it's the same way. With art, back in the day, somebody said that when actors go to audition, you've got to audition like 50 times to get called back once. It's the same thing with music. You have to write a lot of songs until you get a good one. Professional songwriters will tell you that, you have to keep on writing until you get a good one. But, the process has to be enjoyable. So I'm sorry, that was a long answer, but if it was distilled down to one thing, it would be that. Just don't do it for the money and be true to yourself and get joy out of the process.
You can find Paul Guzzone on every streaming service and on his website, paulguzzone.com. That's Paul, Guzzone.com. And apologies for the audio quality this episode. It was a recorded Zoom meeting. We hope you stick around for our next interview that will be coming out this Valentine's Day. See you then. Deaf Love is an anthology series aiming to solidify what love feels like, made possible by stories submitted from viewers. If you have a story of what love does or does not feel like, email us at deaflove.cast@gmail.com. Follow us on Instagram at deaflove.cast for updates and first access to new episodes, or subscribe to us on YouTube at Deaf Love. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.